What's up guys, Chase here at Rocky Mountain HVMC, and today I am showing you how to set sag. Alright guys, so today I'm going to walk you through and I'm going to show you how to set sag on your motorcycle. Now, before we get started, we've got a few things we need to talk about. Now, first and foremost, setting your sag is absolutely crucial. It's probably one of the most important things you're going to do when you are setting up your motorcycle. It's going to make sure the balance of the bike is right, that's going to handle the way you want it to. It's also just going to make for safer riding as well. Now, when I say sag, if you're not familiar with that term, what it means is essentially it's how much the bike sags, or in other words, how much your shock compresses when the rider is both sitting on the motorcycle and also when the bike is just on the ground by itself. Now, you're going to have different types of sag. Now, when I say race sag or rider sag, that is when the rider is actually sitting on the motorcycle. And when the bike is on the ground by itself with nobody on it, that's going to be called your static sag. Now, for most of your big bikes, your 250s, your 450s, your adult riders, your sag is usually going to be right around 100 millimeters. And now that's going to be about 4 inches. Now, when you think about it, your rear shock's going to have about 12 inches of travel. So if you're at 100 millimeters or 4 inches, that's about a third of your travel is going to be used in the rider sag. Now, keep in mind though, whenever you're setting sag, doesn't matter what motorcycle it is, always look at your owner's manual. That's going to give you a window of where your sag should be. So once you get it within that window, then you can do some fine tuning to get it to where you want it. Now remember, more sag means the rear end's going to sit lower. That's going to mean the bike's going to be a little bit more stable at higher speeds. And then if you have less sag, that means the bike is going to steer or corner a little bit better. So if you're a desert racer, maybe you want a little more sag. If you're a track guy, you might want a little bit less. Again, you're just going to fine tune it to how you want the bike to handle. Now, setting sag is actually fairly simple. All you're doing really is just adjusting the preload on the spring that comes on the shock. And remember, everyone's different shape and size no matter what bike you're on. You always want to get the sag set up for you. So now I'm going to show you guys how to do it step by step. Okay, so before we get started today, there's a couple of things you're going to need in order for you to set your sag. First, you're going to need a friend or two, and I'll explain that here why in just a minute. Another is you're going to need a way to measure your sag. So you got two options. Today we're going to be using the Motion Pro sag scale. It's really nice. It makes it convenient. If you don't have one of those, a tape measure will work just fine. If you are going to use a tape measure, you're going to want a piece of paper to write down your measurements, and also you're going to want a pen to do that. I'm going to be using a Sharpie. A Sharpie is also nice, and you'll see why. When we're measuring the sag, I'll mark a reference point on the fender to make sure we're measuring the same spot. And then you're going to need a punch tool or a preload adjuster tool. If you don't have one of these, you can use just a long screwdriver, but these, because they are curved at the end, it does make it a little bit easier. You're going to need some sort of hammer. That's going to be used to loosen or tighten the lock nut rings on your shock. And if you're going to be doing this solo, a really nice tool to have is this Motool digital sag scale. This is making it to where you can take a 2- or 3-man job. You can actually set the sag by yourself, when you're out riding or at the track. So those are the tools that we're going to need to set our sag today. All right, so the first step that we need to do is we need to measure the free sag on the motorcycle. Now, free sag refers to when the bike is on a stand and there is 0 weight on the shock. Now, you have a couple ways to do this, like I mentioned before. You can use a tape measure. I'll show you how to do that with the tape measure first. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to measure from the axle up to a reference point on your fender. So you can see right here, I've actually already marked a place. This is where we're going to measure the sag from each and every time. So I'm going to place the tape measure here just in the axle. I'm going to raise it up right to that point. I'm going to be right at 60 centimeters. So if I convert that to millimeters, that's going to be 600 millimeters. So you'd want to take that number 600, you want to write that down on your piece of paper, you don't want to forget it, and then we're going to subtract the rider sag from that here in just a second. Now, so that's how you do it with the tape measure, and now here is why we like to use this Motion Pro sag scale so much. It takes all that math out of the equation. You don't need to be writing down any numbers. What you're going to do is you're going to take the sag scale, and you're going to see that reference point that we have, and what you're going to do is you're just going to zero it out. So I'm going to loosen this nut down at the bottom, and then I can just slide this down, and once I have that zeroed, I can just tighten this back up. Now when I measure the rider sag and the rider sits on the motorcycle, I'm going to know exactly what my sag is. I'm not going to have to do any equations from there. All right, so with step 2, now what we're going to do is we're going to measure the rider or the race sag. Now, something to keep in mind before you do that is you want to have the bike and yourself set up as if you're going to go out riding. So I've got Gavin here. So Gavin's wearing boots, pants, jersey, helmet. You want to have the bike set up too. So you want to have at least a half tank of gas or more. If you wear a tool belt, if you wear a backpack when you're out riding, you'd also want to keep that in mind, because you got to remember, any weight that you add is going to affect the sag of your motorcycle. So remember, have the bike set up as if you're going to go riding. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna have Gavin get on the motorcycle and we're gonna get him in the correct position to where we wanna take that next measurement for the sag. So have Gavin get on the bike, and also this is a good time to point out, this is why I mentioned you might wanna have a buddy with you. Chance here is helping us out. He's gonna be holding the bike stable, so when Gavin gets on the bike, he doesn't have to support himself, and that allows him just to be natural on the bike. So Gavin, hop on there. Now when Gavin's on the motorcycle, you want to always measure when the rider's in the same position, because if you change your position on the seat, that's always going to change your sag. So you want to be a little bit forward of center on the seat, so a little bit farther towards the gas tank. And then you want to have your hands on the handlebars. You want to just pretend like you're in your riding position. Now once Gavin's set, a good idea is to always just give a couple presses on the rear. That's going to compress the shock a little bit. It gets rid of any stiction you might have. And it's just going to help the shock settle into its natural position. So now, once that's done, I'm going to take that measurement on the sag again. Okay, so now I'm going to take that measurement again. So I've got my sag scale here. Again, I'm going to go to the exact same point that I already marked on the fender. So with Gavin on the bike right now, you can see we're sitting right about 96 millimeters of sag. So like I said, we want to be right around 100. That's what this bike calls for. So what we need to do from here to get an extra 4 millimeters of sag is we're going to need to loosen or lengthen the spring on the shock, which is going to allow for a little bit more sag, so we're going to do that next. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to lengthen the spring on the shock. Now, we're at 96 millimeters of sag, we want to be at 100, so how we're going to get those extra 4 millimeters is we're going to loosen the lock nuts that are on here to allow this spring to be a little bit longer. Now on your Japanese bikes, you're going to have 2 lock nuts. The upper lock nut is what's going to hold everything in place, it's going to be your locking nut, and the bottom, that's going to be where your spring seats against, and adjusting that, either loosening or tightening that, is going to allow us to adjust the compression on the spring. So what we're going to do, oh, and one thing to keep in mind as well, is on your KTMs, your Husqvarna models, a lot of those will actually have a plastic lock nut that has a pinch bolt. So it's going to be the same thing, you're just going to need to loosen that pinch bolt before you adjust it. So what I'm going to do is you're going to have these 2 lock nuts. I'm going to take my punch and my hammer, I'm going to put it here on the top lock nut, and I'm going to loosen this and move it up the shock. So I'm going to hit this. Now once that breaks free, you can actually just go ahead, get your fingers in there, and you can start to loosen it. It's going to be a little bit faster. If this is if it's binding up or it's hard to get going, a good idea is to get some WD-40, spray it on the threads. That's going to help you loosen that up a lot easier. Okay, so now I've loosened that upper lock nut. So now what I need to do is I need to do the same thing, and I'm going to take this lower lock nut and I'm going to loosen that as well, and that's going to allow the shock or the spring to lengthen, which is going to give us a little bit more sag. So I'm going to do that next. Now what you can do, another tip, is if you want, you can take a Sharpie like I showed you earlier, and you can actually mark one of the notches on the nut. That's going to let you know when you've done a full circle. And keep in mind that usually one full rotation is about 2 to 3 millimeters. So we're going to do a full rotation and then see where we're at from there. So, all right, so now I've got Gavin back on the motorcycle. So we adjusted the sag the first time, we measured it again. We were still off just a little bit. So I loosened that lock nut, 1 more rotation. So in total, we came out about 2 full rotations. We loosened it. Now remember, if you have too much sag on your motorcycle, well then you would want to tighten that nut, and that's going to allow the bike to sag a little bit less. So now Gavin's back on the motorcycle. Again, exact same riding position he was in earlier. So I'm going to take my sag scale, I'm going to put it in the exact same spot, and you can see I am right at 100 millimeters, and that is right where we want to be. So that's with the sag scale. Now, if you're using a tape measure, now you've got your first measurement that you took earlier, and you wrote that down on a piece of paper. So what you would do now is you do the same thing. You're going to measure from your axle to that reference point, and whatever that number is in millimeters, you're going to subtract that from that first number that you wrote down, and that should be right around 100 millimeters. So in our case, the second measurement, if it were 500 millimeters, you subtract that from 600, which was the first number, and that gives you 100 millimeters of rider sag. So now what we need to do is we need to put the bike on the ground with Gavin off the motorcycle, and we're going to measure our static sag to make sure that's where we want it as well. Okay, so now we've got the race sag set. Now the next step is going to be checking your static sag on the motorcycle. Now like I said before, static sag is when the bike is off the stand and there's nobody sitting on the motorcycle. You're just checking the weight of the motorcycle and how much it compresses the shock on its own. So just like you did before, you're going to take your sag scale or your tape measure, come to your axle, come to where you marked your fender previously, So right now we're at 34 millimeters of static sag. So if you're taking your tape measure, you'd measure that in millimeters and then subtract that from the original measurement. For us it was 600, and that's going to give you your static sag. Now for most big bikes, you're going to be right between about 30 to 40 millimeters of static sag. Now, but make sure, check your owner's manual, that's going to tell you what you need to be at. But in this case, we're right where we need to be. But if you were to say well under that, say you're at 20 millimeters, well what that means is you've put so much preload on the spring to support the rider's weight that you now don't have any static sag. And if you're well over that, say you're at 50 millimeters, well you might want to look into a softer spring. And again, if you're well under that, you want to look into a stiffer spring. But now that you've got the race sag set, your static sag's right where it needs to be. Now what you want to do is just tighten up that lock nut or that pinch bolt if you have a Husqvarna or a KTM, and you're ready to go out and ride. All right guys, so that wraps up our how-to video on how to set sag on your motorcycle. Now I can't reiterate enough how important it is to make sure you have that set up correctly for you. Again, it's gonna really affect how your bike handles. It's also gonna make it safer. And always refer to your owner's manual if you guys have questions, if you need to know where your race sag should be at. If you guys have any thoughts, comments, or questions on this video, we'd love to hear those. Comment below, write your questions. We will always get your questions answered. You can give us a call here at Rocky Mountain or chat live online. We have technicians standing by ready to help you guys out. And to see the tools that we used in this video, if you want to pick some of those up, just click on the link. You can see everything that you're going to need to set sag on your motorcycle. I'm Chase at Rocky Mountain, and we'll see you on the trails.